So today I'm going to show you how money works in cycle. So historically, banks used to take money for keeping your stuff, for keeping your money safe. But as we progress towards the modern society, what happened was that the bank started to incentivize you through the means of interest by keeping your money. Now, if you get robbed, I'm not telling you that you will get robbed. I don't want you to get robbed. But if you get robbed, no one is responsible and you will lose your money. Maybe the police or the cops would find the perpetrator, but most probably you will lose your money. But if the bank goes default, FDIC insurance is at around $250,000, and if you have multiple accounts, basically you could hedge your money. You don't care if the bank goes default or not. You keep your money safe and you get interest by just keeping your money. Have you ever wondered why that happened? That happened because of the simple concept of lending out money. So when you take your money out, the bank, what they do is, let's say you deposit $100,000, bank typically try to lend it out as soon as they can. And this is the concept of fractional reserve. Let's say the bank, lends out 90% of the money that they get from the depositor. Most probably, the person that borrows money also keep that money in the bank, which also get borrowed out, which also get lent out. So it works in cycles. So if you keep $100,000 in a bank, typically $300,000 of that money would be lent out. So bank is in net negative, right? And they rely on lenders to give the money back for them to function, or the bank would collapse. And no government historically wants the bank to collapse, simply because of the fact that if the bank collapses, if the depositors don't have the money back when they ask for it, the trust in the banking system, the trust in the Federal Reserve would go down. So generally, I have never seen a bank going bankrupt, simply because Federal Reserves or the central banks cannot afford that. If the trust of the common man goes down in the banking system, no one is going to trust the currency, and eventually the currency would fail. Especially in the civilized world of United States, there is no scenario that any government, be it democratic or republican, be it left or right, would let the currency collapse, right? That's the strongest currency. But still, what happens is that banks have to lend it out. They have all this infrastructure in place, they have all these employees working day and night. They have 24/7 call centers, they have locations, they have online infrastructure, they have offline infrastructure. So it's in their best interest to lend the money out as soon as they can. That's how they make their share of profit, and that's how they pay off for all the infrastructure that they are paying for in order for all of this to work. But have you ever wondered what happens when this is the pressure that the banks are facing? They have to lend out money or they would go bankrupt. And no organization, no company, be it banking or non banking, would ever want to go bankrupt, right? They all want to be profitable. So what happens is that banks take extra effort to lend out all the money. They get the money from depositors like you and like me, and they lend it out as soon as they can. Now you might say that I have deposited $100,000 and I go to the bank and they will, let me take that money out in a second. I'll send a check and that would be honored, right? But the way that they are working is that they are relying that all of the people will not come to the bank and say, give us our money back, right? They cannot do that, because if they do that, they don't have the money. They have already lent it out. How would they get the money back? If I borrow the money from the bank, I have a 5 years term or 10 years term on that loan or mortgage to pay that money back. I cannot get back. If I was the only depositor of the bank, let's say I have $1 million and I was the only depositor of the bank, I could not get that money back, because the way that the bank make profit is by giving you a small percentage as an interest. If you have a savings account, on checking account, they don't give interest. The way that the bank make money is simply by charging the borrowers more than what they give to the depositors. That's how the bank functions. And that's what happened in the depression of 1930s, when most of the borrowers came and asked for their money. Bank doesn't have the money, right? Bank don't own the money. Bank have already lent out that money, and that turns into cycle. If a small group of people ask for the money and they are denied for their money, the news spread, and then all of the people want the money back, and the banks collapse. And that's when federal government comes into play. They will just print out the money. Money is not a hard asset. It's just a promise. If you ever read a dollar bill, it says that I promise, this promises to pay all your debts, federal and public. This is just a promise. And that's how central government comes into play. That's how bank would never collapse, simply because they would go to the federal bank. No federal bank wants any bank to collapse, right? No Federal Reserve wants any banks to collapse because that would collapse the entire currency and that they cannot afford. Now, this is not true with the cryptocurrency simply because no one can print cryptos. And that's why we saw it with Celsius, we saw it with FTX. They tried to use the same game on cryptos. But since that's a hard asset, it could not be printed. If you have it, you have it. If you don't have it, you don't have it. There's no printer in the world that can print Bitcoin, or there's no printer in the world that could print Ethereum or any other hard currency. There's no printer in the world that could print gold, right? And the way the JFK, John F. Kennedy, the president, was assassinated the day after he said the gold would be linked with the dollar. He was assassinated a day after. And there are many conspiracy theories. I don't want to get into those. But yeah, the next president, what he did was immediately, I don't remember the order, but I will mention it here. The first order of the president after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy was to de-link gold with the US dollars, right? They didn't want the gold to be linked with US dollars. And that was a temporary measure. Remember, that was a temporary measure. I will link the order down below. That was a temporary measure, but that never got revoked because if the governments have the ability to print money, no one would lose trust on US dollars. And that's true with most major economies and even minor economies. No federal or central bank would ever let the banks go collapse simply because that would make their citizens or people lose the faith in the banking system and would lead to the collapse of the currency. So what happens is, coming back to the point, what happens is that the bank starts to lending out more and more just to make profit, right? They don't want to go every day to the Federal Reserve to ask them to print the money. They want to stay profitable. So in order to make their banks profitable, what happened was that the banks got this pressure to lend out more and more money. They started to lend out more money, which means that there was more money in economy. And one thing I know about money is that it's like a pea. If you have it, you have to throw it out. So the spending began to increase. And by the simple principle of demand and supply, people wanted to have more and more stuff, right? The stuff that they could not have afford from their regular wages. People wanted to buy that smartphone that they couldn't afford, the laptop that they couldn't afford, and the television that they couldn't afford, simply because the bank started to finance it. Bank had its own ulterior motive of, making money through interest. So people started to buy the things that they couldn't generally or typically afford from their wages, and that put them in more pressure. And since the people started to buy more and more stuff by the simple principle of demand and supply, the supply was the same, but the demand got up simply because people had more money, because banks lent out more money, everything become more expensive, and that's when inflation happens. But now the Federal Reserve don't like inflation, so what did they do? They started to increase the interest rate. They started to make borrowing money more expensive, because for the political purpose or non-political purpose, Federal Reserve always want to keep inflation level very low. And now when borrowing money became more expensive and people had huge EMIs to pay, they couldn't afford to generally buy the stuff that they did. They bought the real estate that they couldn't typically had with their wages, but because of the bank's restlessness in giving money to the borrowers, they bought the real estate, they bought the stuff that they couldn't typically afford, and the interest rates going up. So, which means that borrowing money is getting more expensive. Feds did it to control the inflation. This means that people stopped paying their EMI, which means that the bank was not able to give the depositors their money back, right? Banks relied on these borrowers paying them back to give their money back. And that's what happened in 2009. We had the Great Recession. As I already mentioned in this video, that if bank is unable to pay a certain percentage of people their money back, people panic, and then all of the people want their money back, right? Now the banks are not able to pay back simply because they are not getting the money that they lent out to the borrowers, and that causes a major recession. That's what happened in 2009 when Lehman Brothers collapsed. Depositors were not able to pay back, and the greed of the banks is such that banks lent out the money to the people who just came out, who just walk out from the jails. They didn't check their credit, they didn't check anything about their background. They just lent out the money simply because of the profit that they make from the interest. And that is when the second chapter of the story starts. So after the rapid inflation starts the series of recession, right? When people don't have money to pay off to the bank and every commodity, every asset is at all-time high. The reason is simple. When banks were distributing or lending out money freely, everyone had to buy. Everyone was buying more than what they could have typically afforded. So now people don't have money. Feds are coming into play. They are increasing the interest rates, and people don't have money. And the inflation is rising simply because of the fact that banks were bailed out. And how do Federal Reserve make sure that the banks are bailed out? Simply by printing money. They cannot do anything else. They don't want the economy to crash. They just can print money and bail out investors. As an after effect of that, we see that the inflation rises even more. And during the time when there was the cycle of inflation that was going on, the supply also increased, not to catch the demand, but it tried to catch the demand. It increased, but it gradually increased. But now people don't have money because their house were foregone, mortgages were not being paid off, and people tried to work more. Right? They tried to save money. People tried to curb their spendings. And what happened? The small and medium businesses had to lay their employees off because if they cannot generate the revenue, they're not going to pay the employees out of their own pocket, right? So it had a compounding effect. On one hand, people don't have money, so they cannot spend more. And on other hand, people were laid off simply because businesses couldn't afford to pay their employees' salary, right? So the only option the businesses had were to either shut down or cut their employees by a massive number. And that's the cycle of recession, right? That's what we saw when Lehman Brothers collapsed in the year of 2009. Though it was bailed out by President Obama, everything was in a free fall, right? The stock market collapsed, the housing market collapsed, gold collapsed, and cryptocurrencies or crypto was non existent at that time, and everything collapsed. And now, when the supply has already increased to match the demand during the inflation period, people are not buying stuff. What happens? Now everything comes back down, controlling the inflation. Everything, the prices of commodity comes back down, right? And then Federal Reserve comes back into play and they decrease the interest rates, right? Simply because of the fact that everything is going down and now they want the money to pour over an economy. The only goal of Federal Reserve is to stop the inflation, right? And they have achieved it by making sure that people don't spend. Federal Reserve don't like when markets are going up. Federal Reserve don't like when people are spending too much, right? But now they decrease the interest rate and then the cycle of inflation starts again. When the interest rates are decreased, borrowing money becomes easier. People then again start to spend more, and then we get to the cycle of inflation. So that's how money works. First, lending money is easier. People spend too much, way more than what they could have typically afford. And then what happens is that people cannot repay the money that they have borrowed, and bank goes bankrupt. Right? We see bankruptcy happening every time. But no Federal Reserve ever want people to not have confidence in their currency. They bail out the banks, they bail out the depositors, and then starts the series of inflation. Interest rate rises, money in the market is more limited, right? Borrowing money gets more and more tougher, and then starts the cycle of recession. And then after recession, prices of everything goes down, and then Federal Reserve makes borrowing money easier and people borrow more, and then we have the cycle of inflation. And that's how it works. In every 10 years we have the half cycle. In 2010 we had a recession. In 2020 we had a recession when COVID happened, and that's how it would happen, right? And probably in 2030 we will have a recession. Now, the ideal thing that I do or I want to do every time this happens is that I want to buy when the money is tight, right? That's why I have my savings. And then when the inflation happens, I sell off my assets. And that's how it works. Thank you for watching this video.